Judy, Rees, welcome to Nova Scribes. It's great to have you here. The time is yours.
Thank you very much. It's very exciting. I'm so interested in what you as visual facilitators, visual practitioners will make of what I've got to share today. I personally identify as a visual practitioner. I wish I was. I wish I could draw. But I'm in awe of people who are able to do graphic recording, graphic facilitation, sketchnoting, and all of those things. And I think that you will find clean language and metaphor interesting and valuable in your work. Before we get going, a couple of things that I'd like to mention. One is, if you are somewhere quiet, if it's possible for you to unmute yourself, please do. As facilitators, you'll probably already know the value of that. That when you're doing any kind of class or presentation, if you can hear a little bit of breathing, a little bit of laughter, a little bit of background noise, it gives you just that little bit of feedback that helps you know whether you're on the right track or not. So if you're willing to share your breathing with the group, that will really help. Thank you very much. Of course, if you've got background noise and dogs and all the rest of it, then stay on mute. Similarly, if you're able to keep your camera on, please do. I'm going to keep you on gallery view. If you want to read the slides to behind me or whatever, you can switch to speaker view, as you prefer. At various points during this session, I will probably call on people by name to speak. If at any point I ask you to speak and you don't want to, just wave, say pass, just don't speak, whatever you prefer. It's all optional, as is participating in the small group activities. And you will get the best value from this session if you do participate in the small group activities. A lot of this clean language stuff sinks in best when you experience it. So my recommendation is to dive into the small groups and do the activities I recommend. I believe, let me just check with you, that we have a total of 2 hours, so 1 hour and 50 minutes remaining. Get that wrong and all sorts of things go horrible. And we'll have a very short break at the middle, somewhere in the middle of that, so that people can move, stretch, and attend to their physical needs, helping you to concentrate in the second half. Any questions about the logistics before we go on? In which case, let's start by asking you a really important clean question, which is, what would you like to happen in this session? Let's see, have we got time to just very quickly hear from, no, what we're going to do is a chatterful. We're going to, everybody write one sentence about what you'd like from the session, pop it in the chat, but don't hit return just yet. So what would you like from this session? Pop it in the chat, but don't hit return until I say so. We're more or less there. On the count of 3, hit return. 1, 2, 3, go. Lovely. May I call on just 2 or 3 people to elaborate just a little bit? Carla, say a little bit more about what you'd like from the session.
Okay, I am off mute.
Yeah.
So I am a coach as well as a change person. And sometimes I use the same old metaphors all the time. So I just want more confidence that I can pull the logical, sensible metaphors and not always have to just use on the butterfly cocoon for change. I want more.
So a few more metaphors. Nice idea. Thank you. What about you, Rosita?
Yeah. Hi. I'm a coach also and a facilitator and a trainer. So I would love to learn more about using metaphors in facilitation process.
Thank you. And Carrie, what about you?
Yeah, I'm also a facilitator doing a lot of work with complex collaborations, often across sectors and involving technical audiences and non-technical audiences trying to work together. And I think I'm really steeped in inquiry, but I don't rely on metaphors as much in my work. And so I'm just really intrigued by this kind of intersection of metaphor, inquiry, and clean language.
It can get really, really interesting, particularly with mixtures of different audiences who often have very different metaphors and how they're thinking about things. Let's do some stuff to help you understand what we're talking about when we're talking about clean language and metaphor. To begin with, has everybody got a sticky note or similar? A bit of paper or a bit of cardboard will do the job. And something like a felt pen, not a pencil, because then we wouldn't be able to see, but something like a felt tip and a sticky note. And I'm going to ask you to draw your answer to a question, which is this. When you are working at your best, you are like what? I'm going to keep talking while you draw. It's one of those questions with no right or wrong answer. Whatever comes up for you is absolutely fine. There's not going to be a test on it later, and it's not a drawing competition. I always say that, but you guys are visual practitioners, so that doesn't matter. I'm going to be amazed by the drawings in this chunk, I know. So thinking about any aspect of your work, if you want to choose a single aspect of your work, you know, for me, if I'm using clean language in coaching, that's a bit different to when I'm advising an organization on how to develop their hybrid conference. So I might choose one of those rather than try and do both. Answers to this kind of question have included all sorts of things. When I'm working at my best, I'm like an express train. When I'm working at my best, I'm all ears. When I'm working at my best, I'm like a butterfly flying between flowers in a garden. When I'm working at my best, I'm efficient and organized, and I've got all my things about me. Whatever the answer is for you is the one to draw. We'll just give you another few seconds before diving into an activity with that. Okay, last few seconds for that, and then we'll do something with it. Now, I know there are a couple of people, because they've told me already, that have had some clean language training before. Can you give me a quick wave if that applies to you? So even basic clean language training, have you had any clean language training before? Now would be a good time to know. Okay, that's lovely. If you have had clean language experience, one of the things I'd invite you to pay attention to during the course of these 2 hours is, how are other people getting to grips with this for the first time? Notice what they're doing. What are the things that they enjoy and find easy and natural? And what are the things that trip them up? Because that can be really high value if you're coming to this afresh. Okay, we're going to dive. It's okay, Bob. Is that your work so far?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes.
Excellent. He's showing. So Bob is going to be live graphic recording this event, which is always good to see. Okay, in a moment, I'm going to invite you to pop into breakout rooms of about 3 people and spend about 5 minutes comparing and contrasting the drawings that you've made. The challenge is for you to, I've got it, Brian, don't worry, because I want to put you in a breakout room. The challenge is to pay attention to the differences between your different drawings. Does that make sense? So you're just going to go into the breakout rooms, compare and contrast what you've drawn, pay attention to differences. Opening the rooms now. Welcome back. So let's hear from a few of the groups. What did you discover? Did you manage to find some differences between your drawings? Isabel, what happened in your group?
Well, it was interesting. We had a shared theme of radiating but had visualized it in different ways. And so it was interesting to just sort of find that common denominator, which makes sense given the shared sort of type of work that we all do. But the things we focused on in that theme were actually quite different.
So a shared theme of radiating, and the things were different. What kind of different?
Well, one person had a sun, for instance, and someone else had more of themselves as part of a web of connection. And then I had something where it was sort of connection, but through sort of sparks, all around. So very, very different ideas. Yeah.
So a sun, a web of connection, and sparks.
Yes.
Thank you. Interesting. Philip, what happened in your group?
We had many rivers and flows going on. So it had much to do about the idea of water and adaptability. And we had some interesting conversation about context, where some people thought more about context. And one of our members did a lot with the idea of being a container of support, a sturdy support to provide a platform for people to have a conversation.
And rivers and flows and sturdy support. And Sarah, you were saying in the chat that you found more similarities than differences. Say a little bit more about that. You're muted.
Great. Yeah, so we thought it was sort of interesting that we both chose such simple metaphors that could, like, at one time be opposite, where like a sun is somewhat static and the river is flowing, but the two of them kind of have the same energy, like create the same kind of energy flow. Like you can get energy from the sun and you can get energy from the river. So I think that we found more similarities there in that than differences.
Thank you. And Sean, what were you noticing?
I was in the same group with Sarah, and so it's interesting. I thought it was just interesting that both of us, we just kind of leaned into more what our similarities were than what our differences were, which I think would have been part of the point of the exercise.
Thank you. Yeah, so it is part of the point of the exercise. Let me show you what I mean. Can I have an indication from who had a sun in their drawing? Give me a quick wave. So Sean had a sun, Carla had a sun, Rachel had a sun. Any other suns? Excellent. Would you mind holding up your stickies, you three? Lovely. So Sean, what kind of sun is your sun?
What kind of sun? Just a simple line drawing the sun.
Simple line drawing of a sun. And Rachel, what kind of sun is your sun?
It's a part of the ecosystem that I drew, and also a little bit of a meaning or like a metaphor of like vision or strategy or like that kind of energy.
So vision, strategy, part of an ecosystem, all of that kind of thing. And Sean, a simple line drawing of a sun. And Carla, what kind of sun was your sun?
So my sun was just me feeling like I was the sun. I mean, I took your question probably very literally, and the sun represented me, and it was bright and shining and radiating.
And is there anything else about the sun when it was bright and shiny and radiating?
And hot.
And hot. And Sean, is there anything else about your sun?
Okay, well, I guess I did take that question you just asked me quite literally as well. So the reason I drew a sun was because when I am working at my best, I'm happy and warm like the sun and full of energy like the sun is. And the people around me whose job, it's my job to support them in their work, are also full of energy and happy and working at their best.
Thank you very much indeed. And Rachel, is there anything else about your sun?
I like it. I really like the sunshine and light, and I get a lot of energy from light. And so I tend to use the sun a lot in drawings, and just I pay attention to light and sunshine a lot in my life.
Thank you. And let's leave that little activity there. Let me unpack some of the bits that we just did. You've all spotted that there's something here about similarity and difference. And clean language as a precision inquiry technique is principally, I keep thinking principally about clean language, and then I think, oh no, it's not that that's principally, it's something else that's principally. One of the most important things about clean language is how it can be used to find out about different people's different experiences. So in that example, we had 3 people who had a sun in their drawing, but by asking clean language questions about their drawings, we found out what was different about the drawings. We could have done the same activity with the rivers in the group, and we'd have discovered what was different about the rivers. And just to be really, really explicit, everybody think of a flower. In your mind's eye, have a flower. Let's go. What kind of flower is your flower? Richard, what kind of flower is your flower?
It's a generic shaped flower.
Generic shaped flower. And Rachel's got a peony. Sarah, what kind of flower is your flower?
Oh, mine's a peony. I just spelled pony.
Excellent. So Rachel and Sarah, you've both got peonies. Sarah, what kind of peony is your peony?
It's about this large. It is pink on the inside and comes out to white.
Pink on the inside, comes out to white, and it's about this large. And Rachel, what kind of peony is your peony?
It's also a pink one. It's pretty big, and it's on a bush, like a picture. Like I had a picture in my mind of a peony.
It's pretty big, and it's pretty big on a bush. And is there anything else about your peony?
It smells really good.
Smells really good. And Sarah, is there anything else about your peony?
It is in a vase with others in the middle of my dining room table.
Thank you. So brilliant example. So you can also see in the chat that when everybody thought of a flower, we had a large variety of flowers. We typically have a couple of daisies, a couple of sunflowers, a couple of roses, and in this case we had a couple of peonies. By asking a couple of questions about those peonies, we discover that one is on a bush and has a scent, and the other is in a vase with other flowers. Just tease out the differences. Now, how is that useful? Well, it's useful in a whole bunch of situations. For example, when people are using when people are doing research projects and they're interviewing a whole bunch of people about their feelings about things, it's really, really easy to get people to say the same words as each other. But if you want to find out what people really think, you need to ask some questions about that. The kind of precision questions that find out what people are really thinking and feeling. And that's where clean language comes in. Clean language was originally devised by David Grove to ask about metaphor. And metaphor is the unconscious, it's the native language of the unconscious mind. We think in metaphor. For human beings, metaphor is the stuff of thought. As tiny babies, we learn by comparing one kind of thing to another kind of thing. So as tiny babies, we realize that warmth and love are connected. We know that important things in our lives are big. And as we learn and grow, these metaphors, these comparisons of one kind of thing, such as love, to another kind of thing, bigness, form an internal network, an internal web of the way our own things are connected for us. And those networks are completely unique to the individual. Comments, questions, observations before I throw you into the next activity. Susanna, what sense is it making for you?
Oh, it's making so much sense, and it's just, I just feel all this stuff bubbling inside of me. My question for you, Judy, and I can tell you a little bit more. You had a beautiful sentence, right? Clean language helps us find out what is different. Can you say that again? It just captured it so beautifully for me.
I can't remember what it was, but it was to the effect that clean language helps us. It's a precision questioning technique which aims to help us find out what is different and unique about the individual and their thoughts. So if I were to ask you what kind of bubbling up, your answer would be different to somebody else's thing that might be bubbling up or might be bubbling around them, or all sorts of things are different. Elaine, what sense is all of this making to you?
Oh, it's really resonating. Working in coaching, I work a lot with metaphors, and I find often that when you find a metaphor and explain how you're experiencing what they're telling you and it lands, it can spark a great connection between you and your client, but it can also spark more creative thinking for them. Like they'll build on it, and the river it's really scary right now, and I don't know how to navigate the rapids. So I love this. And the way you put it all together is beautiful.
It's really interesting what you say. And it illustrates the power of metaphor. And as facilitators, we use metaphor all the time, often unconsciously. So particularly as visual facilitators, you will be offering your group a frame, a framework, an illustration around, perhaps the process is going to be like a journey through a landscape. So as facilitators, even as coaches, we often offer the group a metaphor. Now, here's where it gets interesting. In clean language, in David Grove's original idea with clean language, the concept is to reduce the number of metaphors that the facilitator, the coach, the leader introduces, and allow people to take the floor for themselves, to use their own unique metaphors, and as far as possible, only those unique metaphors, to tell their stories. I'm going to invite you to go back into exactly the same groups you were in, so we don't have to do the introductions again. I'm going to go straight back to the same groups and just spend a couple of minutes comparing and contrasting how is metaphor and potentially clean language relevant to your current work? So just take a moment in a small group to think about, how is what I've just been saying about metaphor, about clean language, relevant to you? Let's keep pulling all this esoteric metaphorical stuff closely to what you do. Is that okay? How's metaphor relevant to your current work? Just, I think we can do this in 3 minutes plus the countdown timer. Opening the rooms now. Just a couple of people. Let's hear from just a couple of people about what was discussed in your groups. Who haven't we heard from yet? Bob, what was happening in your group?
It was very interesting to hear Sarah talk about that she starts with a blank sheet of paper, because just thinking about how we practice as graphic recorders is kind of important, because we do throw up images at people and it might not be the appropriate one. But then also, and I forget who was in the other person in my group, but talking about that her parents were anthropologists. And so it was very natural for her to recognize that other people didn't think the way that she thought. And so that she now works with Indigenous people and understands that even though they, show up for work in a suit and tie or however they show up for work, that they might have a different way of thinking, that even if they look the same, they might not think the same.
Interesting, thank you. David Grove, the creator of Clean Language, had a mixed Maori and white New Zealand heritage. And he believed that that heritage gave him some of the pieces that turned into Clean Language. David, what was happening in your group, or what's relevant about this to your work?
Oh, I would think, I guess I'm thinking language in and of itself as a meta, M-E-T-A, and for, F-O-R, that I think it has a much broader and wider purpose, and it has a simplicity, a symbolism. And in our group, we talked about the applications in our work for storytelling. And also there was some discussion around the difference between paradigm and metaphor. One person was wrestling with, are they using a paradigm or a metaphor, et cetera. So yeah, those are some of the thoughts that got kicked around.
Thank you. Interesting. Yeah, I would say that paradigm and metaphor have got a lot of similarities. Often when we're in the Clean Language world, we tend to use the very broadest possible definition of metaphor, which is typically that a metaphor compares one kind of thing to another kind of thing. So that would include all sorts of things: parables, similes, analogies, stories, anything that could possibly be called comparing one kind of thing to another kind of thing falls under this definition of metaphor. And I've already mentioned that metaphor is the native language of the unconscious mind. That's why it matters. Clean is undoubtedly a metaphor. And the idea of the metaphor of clean in Clean Language is that the questions have been cleaned of presuppositions and metaphors and the presence of the questioner as far as possible. Let me show you some examples of the Clean Language questions, and you have already heard me use them. In the next activity, you're going to use them. Now, these two questions, did I remember to share my slides earlier on? If not, I'll do it right now. In Clean Language questions, these are two examples of Clean Language questions, and we're only going to use these two for this particular event. I'm popping them in the chat as well. What kind of X, and is there anything else about X, where X stands for one or more of the other person's words? Now, the core Clean Language question set is about 9 or 10 questions, depending how you count them, whether you count what things as 1 or 2 questions, because there's slightly different variations to them. But 90% of the time, you can achieve the result you want just with these 2 questions. So they got nicknamed the lazy Jedi questions, that you can use these 2 questions to channel the Force if you can't be bothered to learn all the rest. So what kind of X, and is there anything else about X, are the lazy Jedi questions, and they are examples of Clean Language questions. And you're going to be using those in this next activity. I'm going to ask Brian this time to mix up the groups so that everybody is in pairs. And the idea here is, once again, you're going to be using the drawing that you made earlier, your sun, your river, whatever it might be, that is your answer to when you're working at your best, you are like what? And you're just going to, rather than just chatting about the differences, you're going to use these questions to find out more about what they've drawn or written, if they've written some words on it as well, but what have they drawn? And you do that by starting by asking, when you're working at your best, you're like what? And they tell you in a few words. And then you use those questions. What kind of? Is there anything else about? And you can use those questions as many times as you like, in any order, to find out about what they've drawn. I think we're all here. Excellent. So, how was that experience when you were being asked the questions? What did you notice?
Can I just jump in, Judy, or type
Yeah,
in?
go ahead. Go ahead.
I thought it was really interesting what it opened up that wasn't even necessarily conscious. So a little bit of got me to connect to some of the intuitive elements and unconscious elements of what I had drawn.
Mm-hmm.
Opened up some of the unconscious elements. Somebody's writing in. I can't keep track of the chat at the same time. So, Sarah, what you really had to think? What kind of think? You're muted as well.
Oop, there we go. So as Elaine was asking me the questions, the lazy Jedi questions, I really had to build out the environment that my river was in. And that happened earlier with the flower too. It's like, okay, where is this? What's happening? And in doing so, that really illustrated for me how the environment impacts my metaphor, and how, like, you know, a river, like anyway, my river is in a forest. It's gently it's moving forward quickly, and it's nourishing the banks of the river, and then the banks of the river are nourishing me as the river. And so when I'm doing my best work, what I realize with that metaphor is part of why I do when I'm doing my best work is that I am getting as much from my participants in my workshops as I am giving to them. So there's this really nice back and forth that happens. So that was kind of cool.
Thank you. So for a few people in the room, there is an experience of the questions helping them to really uncover stuff they didn't know they knew about how they do their work at their best. But who had a different experience to that? Sean?
Yeah, I just typed in the chat. I kind of had the opposite experience where I knew when I thought of the metaphor of the sun, I knew exactly what I meant. And it was it was in a particular context for me. And so after I explained that, I was done. I was like, that was the end of it. That was what it meant.
And that's fine too. So sometimes these questions can really explore that spaciousness, all of that stuff. And sometimes there isn't anything else. And that's okay. So just be aware that the questions have different effects on different people at different times, depending what you ask about. Sean?
So just a question. I very strongly wanted to ask clarifying questions whenever I said, is there anything else about X, or what kind of X is it? And it was, I had to notice that I wanted to do that and then choose not to. So that was a challenge for me.
Good noticing. Hold that thought, because we'll pay attention in just a minute to what needs to be true for you to actually do this activity. And that's one of them, to hold the urge to ask some different questions. Anything else about what happened when you were asked the questions? Did anyone have a completely different experience, or even a slightly different experience to the two that have been described so far?
I just wanted to say something about the kind of emotional feeling of it. My experience wasn't so much that I was uncovering new content for myself, but just that it felt really welcoming and easy to just be in my own sphere of thought with those kind of questions, to not be navigating the boundary between me and the questioner as much, and wondering what they wanted to hear or what they were curious about, because the questions are so neutral. So
yeah, so not navigating the boundary between you and the questioner. That is one of the biggest advantages of these questions. Now, some of you will have come across a book by a guy called Chris Voss called Never Split the Difference. It's a book about negotiation. The guy is a CIA hostage negotiator. And while he doesn't use clean language, he does use the concept of parrot phrasing rather than paraphrasing. He uses the other person's own words. And he says that paraphrasing, or what he calls mirroring, is the nearest thing that the FBI, not CIA, FBI has to a Jedi mind trick. Because when you use somebody's words back to them, they intuitively feel that you understand them, that you know them, that you're like them. And it blurs that boundary between the questioner and the questionee. So the person being asked doesn't need to think about the questioner. And that can be really high value.
There's something else I'm just going to jump in here about this, the cleanness of spaciousness and openness. So having been in the coaching world for too long now, people often say this thing of what else? And it's very annoying, actually. I want to, say nothing else, the door's closed kind of thing. And I think if you use these questions, if the questionnaire is very open and spacious and doesn't come with their own selfish curiosity about it, but actually leaves a really open field for it to close or open or not, or the person. I think that also has the tonality of spacious language, or of clean, I'm calling it spacious language, clean language. I think there's a gestalt to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's absolutely true. And Brian's saying in the chat that he doesn't mind being annoying by asking what else all the time. But you could try asking, is there anything else?
Yeah, because it's permission. You're asking permission, but you're not even assuming that there is. What else kind of feels aggressive to me sometimes?
So that there's really, really interesting implications of all of this. And I'm noticing the time and noticing that I did promise that we take a short break halfway through. Let's have a 3-minute comfort break. When you come back, I'm going to be asking you about what needed to be true about you for you to actually do that activity. So you might want to think about that while you get your cup of something. We're going to take a 3-minute break. Please mute yourself, mute your video, and stand up, move about, and we'll be back in 3. Okay, is everybody back? Everybody refreshed? Please turn on your cameras. Okay, well, let's dive in to the next bit. My invitation is in this next set of breakout groups, you're going to be in groups again of about 3. Spend a few moments thinking about what needed to be true. How did you need to be in order to ask those questions? Does that make sense as a question? What had to be in place for you to ask the questions? It's once again going to be a lightning quick round, about 3 minutes plus the 30-second countdown. And then we'll hear from a few people when you come back. I'm going to open the rooms before my voice goes completely. So I'm very curious, what did your groups come up with? I'm going to pick on someone we haven't heard from yet. Kathy, what were you talking about in terms of what needs to be in place? You're muted.
In the first place, I misunderstood the question because I thought it was about what you needed to be able to share. So we spent the first few minutes me saying about what we needed to share. But then we spoke about how sometimes you're very conscious about what you're asking. And also there was a conversation about being very clear about what somebody else is drawn and what you perceive that to be, and you not putting that on the person that you're asking.
Yeah, so you've got your own ideas, but you're not putting it on them.
Yeah.
Thank you. Brian, say a bit about what you're putting in the chat.
Well, I was just following what Anna was doing, but it looked like just pasting in some of the thoughts from our group. So from our group, it was being willing to let go. being willing just to be there in the moment, being present, needing an icebreaker, just to connect with the person before launching into questions, being in a place of inquiry.
Thank you. And Nancy, what did your group come up with?
We talked about some similar themes to what Brian just mentioned. You're suspending your inclination to comment on the individual's drawing, listening and not leading, not trying to mirror, kind of letting go of oneself in the process.
Thank you. I think all of that is really, really interesting and useful for groups of people to be able to do. To suspend your own inclination to comment and judge, and instead to listen and pay attention. One of the participants in one of my groups once said, it's like we all agree to treat our imaginary friends as real. And I think that sort of carries the idea. Susanna.
Thanks, Judy. I think where I got confused is like when you said, because this reminded me of the 9 whys activity of digging deeper, but different as well. And I guess my question is, when you said to keep asking the same question about the X, do we continue to use the original metaphor? Or do we go into the words that they're now using?
Mm-hmm. Oh. Who was that said?
I know, I heard that.
Oh, I did. Nancy said that. Like, oh, wow.
Do elaborate, please, on that. Oh.
Do we just stick with the, what is it about that and anything else about that? Or if they bring up something else, can we then transition to that something else? I hadn't even thought about that as an option.
Thank you. So the answer is, it's up to you and your curiosity what you put in the X spot.
Okay.
Once you get deeper into this whole subject, there are systems and ways of choosing what you would put in the X spot. The people who use this stuff in coaching have reasons for choosing the words they're going to ask about. But in a small, simple activity like this, you can choose to ask about anything. Now, I find it really useful to write down the first few words they say and ask about those repeatedly. That, is there anything else about sun? What kind of sun? But then if you ask about something different, you will tend to avoid the problem that Sean expressed, where the person being asked gets frustrated because it feels like you're repeating the same question. So if they say sun and then they say radiance, then you ask a question about radiance. But there are more sophisticated ways of choosing what to ask about, but we're not going there today. Anna.
I was just wondering if the person doesn't ever stop for a breath, and you don't ask any questions at all. I mean, this didn't happen today, but I have had this happen with somebody. How do you manage that? Or what are you supposed to do? I don't know.
It depends what your purpose is. So we haven't even talked about the purpose apart from, isn't this interesting? It might be relevant to your work. Now, for most people in the kind of facilitation work that I hallucinate you guys do, there's not actually a requirement to ask lots of clean language questions. That, it's not part of the gig. If people talk about their answer to when they're working at their best, they're like what? In a nice clear metaphor, and they've drawn it, you probably don't need any more questions. On the other hand, if you're using these precision questions for some other purpose, you might absolutely want to interrupt the person and direct their attention with questions. Now, this brings me on to another reason for asking questions. Questions are some of the most powerful tools for directing attention that we have as coaches, as facilitators, as consultants. Think about it. What happens when you are asked a question? you almost can't help it. Your attention goes to the answer. Even if you've got no intention of answering out loud, your attention goes to the answer. And the result of that is that energy flows where attention goes. So your energy goes towards the answer. Now that has a really important implication when you're asking clean language questions, or even asking starter questions, like when you're working at your best, you are like what? That is that if you want energy to be up and buoyant and light and happy and buzzing in your room or on your Zoom call, you want to be asking about the good stuff. You want to be asking about stuff that makes people smile and feel happy and engaged and interested and curious. When people ask questions about things that make people unhappy, that sends their energy down into unhappiness. And there are certainly purposes for doing that, all sorts of situations. But when you're first using clean language questions, when you're exploring metaphor, I strongly recommend going for the good stuff. Making sense? Angela, say a bit more about what you just commented in the chat. I'm curious.
Yeah, a lot of it just has to do with I'm a visual thinker. So when you were talking about questions, and that's where the energy goes. Even when you ask, what happens when you answer a question, our brains automatically start problem solving. And as we've been talking about, you know, opening space, what I imagine was an open space that we automatically want to kind of fill up. So for me, that was just kind of the way I answered your question of what happens when we ask questions. It's like, I want to fill it up. I want to get my check mark. I want to get it done. So, you know, it's a pothole in a road and I don't want it to be there.
Thank you. Lovely. So we get some really interesting ideas when we're asked these questions. And we've talked about what happens when people do ask these questions. I'm going to quickly share, I hope I've got the right link on the tip of my, no, that didn't work. I've got a blog post I want to quickly share, which is a list of tips for introducing this to your group, which you might find useful. One of the things in there is about asking about things that people like and want more of, going for the good stuff. That will help people not get unhappy about being asked these questions. Another thing that I strongly recommend is keep the chunk of time quite short when you first introduce these kind of questions to a group. 2 minutes, 3 minutes is great, but once you start giving people 10 and 15 minutes, they will find themselves profoundly attracted to problem states. If you want a happy and buoyant group, don't do that. I want to dive into another activity, but I also don't want to rush you if you've got immediate questions and comments that you want to raise at this juncture. Is there anything that you'd like to ask before we dive into the next activity? Anna.
Yes, I'd kind of like to ask about that. How do you know if you've taken them? I mean, is it up to you to feel like you've drained the energy out of the room or something if you've taken them into the problem state?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one of the things that needs to be true when you're asking these questions is you're paying attention to the other person. And you'll be paying attention, we hope, to the kind of cues in terms of body language, voice tone, the kind of words they use that will let you know if they're not going into such a bright and shiny space. They might even tell you, this is really annoying. Please stop asking questions. And you, depending on the reason you're doing this work, you might or might not stop. But I would strongly advise that when you do this for the first few times, go for the good stuff and notice what's happening for the person you're asking or the people you're asking. And you might even want to ask permission, depending on the context, and say to your group, oh, I want to try out a new activity. I haven't done this before. It's all about asking questions. It might be a bit challenging. Please have a go. So people understand that you know, it's up to them and it is experimental, and they can say no. By the way, let me draw attention to a few of the things that happened at the very beginning of this session, because they were not accidental. I think I said to everybody that the activities were optional. I think I said that you are free to participate or not, and you can have your microphone on, you can have your camera on or not. That's a metaphor in itself. It's a frame that says you've got agency in this session. It's not just up to me. And while in Clean Language World we talk about the questions being stripped of the questioner's stuff, their metaphors, their presuppositions, their frames, that doesn't mean that any clean language conversation has no frame at all. Often the framing is even more important than the questions themselves. So you'll hear people talk about using clean language questions. They come originally from the psychotherapy world. And of course, if you're in a psychotherapy frame, certain things are okay to talk about and are normal to talk about. It's perfectly ordinary for people to burst into tears and throw things. That's not particularly usual in a standard business facilitation context. But equally, if you're doing major conflict resolution stuff, tears and throwing is not unusual. So the frame of the conversation changes lots of things, and maybe just as or more important than the questions themselves. I want to give you another experience of these questions before we sort of do a general question session. So to answer your question, Sean, we will have a chunk of time at the end for sort of general questions as far as we can. But I want one more questioning and listening. Frame is context, yeah. So the context setting provided by the leader facilitator. Okay, next activity then. We're going to do a similar but different activity. Once again, grab your sticky notes, grab your pen, and we're going to try a different question. This group is like what? So please draw your answer to that question. This group is like what? Okay. Once again, you're going to be in your breakout rooms and you're going to be practicing those 2 lazy Jedi questions. What kind of X? And is there anything else about X? And you can ask about anything, not just the first thing they say, any words they use, but aim to use only these questions and no other words. I've put them in the chat again. Is everybody comfortable with what the activity is? I think the group are currently in 3s, and I'm going to leave you in 3s. And I'm going to give you a total of 6 minutes. So that means you're going to have to go round, swap roles every 2 minutes. The person who's not actively questioning or answering, your job is A, to make sure they finish at 2 minutes, and B, to notice what's happening to the relationship between the 2 people. Does that make sense? Let's hope it works. I'm going to open the rooms and let's see what happens. Now, before we go any further, I'd love to see everybody's answer. Could we just take a moment to hold them up to the camera? Maybe we can take a screenshot or whatnot. But Nancy, could you hold yours right in front of you because of the the background. Lovely, thank you. Fantastic. Now, if you can see everybody as well, just have a look around at all the different answers. Thank you. It's really, really interesting. And I want to look back at all that on the video. What did you learn by doing that repeated activity or the slightly adjusted activity? What difference did it make doing that activity for you? Elaine, what did you notice?
Oh, my mute is off. I think I noticed a deeper connection
Mm-hmm.
that during this activity where we were sharing about the group rather than ourselves, it really created, for me, more of a connection with the people in the room.
Mm.
And I saw them really forming a deeper connection.
So a deeper connection. Who had a different or a similar experience? Angela.
Yeah. So one thing we finished up about like a minute early in our group, and our experience was a little bit different about the connection. So a lot of times in these groups, it ends up feeling like a bit of a networking group, but this feels a bit more like it's focused on, like we're focusing more on ourselves, and I feel a little bit siloed more than I usually do, which I think is really interesting. By observing, it kind of reminded me of what you said about the psychologist, where the psychologist is meant to say neutral and not make a connection, and it's much more it's less interpersonal. It's about their inner connection to themselves and not their connection to other people as much. That's what I'm noticing with the questions.
Yeah, so there's a connection to self and or a connection to other. Any other observations from that activity?
I think it feels very unfamiliar. So you're very conscious that you might be sort of incompetently doing it.
Yeah, so the asking questions does tend to generate this sense of conscious incompetence, which is, you all know, is part of the process of learning.
Yeah.
So when you introduce this activity to your groups, you might want to set that up as part of your context, your framing. Say, this might be uncomfortable. Can be worth doing. Is there anything else that you noticed in that activity? Was it easier to ask the questions this time than last time? Did anyone find it harder this time round? Sean, say a little bit more about your experience.
Oh, I just typed it in the chat too. I just felt less comfortable coming up with a metaphor about a group of people that I don't know than I did coming up with a metaphor about myself. And then because of that, felt less comfortable asking other people about it.
Yeah, so it changes the frame, doesn't it? You're yourself. You can talk about yourself, but here we got a bunch of people you don't know. Is it okay to call them a flock of birds? Yeah, so all these things, I'm including all these things in this session so that you get an experience of the kind of things that might emerge when you introduce this stuff to your groups. And at the same time, I'm wanting you to, I get so excited by this stuff because so many people use metaphor clunkily when they work with groups, rather than consciously and with precision. Recognizing the difference between people is really, really important. Allowing people to have a few moments of exploring what they think the metaphor should be before the boss shouts over everybody, I think we should be Team Dolphin, or whatever it might be, makes a really big difference to the way groups connect with each other and interact with each other. Now, one of the things that I do with this stuff, I mean, all of this stuff, clean language and a clean mindset and a clean approach to the world, completely underpins all the work I do in terms of facilitating online groups, designing online events, designing online conferences. but it most explicitly informs work that I do with groups and teams specifically, where we use it's an adaptation of work by Caitlin Walker, where we're introducing clean language and clean language models to teams to help them to communicate more effectively with each other. Help them to ask more questions, to clarify what each other means rather than jumping to conclusions, to pay more attention and do more listening, to challenge explicitly based on their own experience rather than on their hallucination of what other people might be thinking or feeling. And that can be really good fun. So that's a process we call collaboration dynamics. Now, it's based on the work of Caitlin Walker, and Anna has had some more experience of the work of Caitlin Walker in Clean for Teams. Anna, are you willing to say a sentence or two about what's different or what's similar between what you've heard today and what you've been learning from Caitlin?
Well, there's a lot that's similar. The clean questions obviously are the same. And well, there's a clean setup that you can use with teams. So that's a particular structure where you're inviting, you kind of go around and you invite the people to contribute how they're going to be and the responsibility that they're going to take. But you're always using these clean questions. I'd like to share how I used it actually in the.
Go ahead.
But that wasn't the question, so.
No, do share though. Go on.
So we've got, I did mention to some others earlier, but one of the things that came out, it was helpful for some people who are transitioning out of the team and they need to step back and let some other people take over. And so the metaphor that came up was having them with their hands tied behind their backs. And that was really helpful for them and for everyone else, so that there's a clear picture that they're not going to do anything. And they're going to watch everything, just the balls fall on the floor. And unless somebody goes to them and says, actually, we realize we still haven't got somebody to fill that role, and can you help us out now? And we'll kind of metaphorically untie your hands and let you contribute. So I can just see it was really helpful for that group straight away.
Thank you. So a lovely illustration of the kind of things that can be done with this kind of thing. So there are a couple of things I want to do next before asking you, right, now you've heard what you've heard so far and you've had the experience that you've had, how might you use this in your work? But before I ask you that, I'm just going to share a few resources. I'm going to share some links in the chat and also mention some resources. So you've already heard mentioned the book with the rainbow leaves on it, Clean Language Revealing Metaphors and Opening Minds, is the one that I co-authored a few years ago now. It's currently available in Russian and Japanese, and at the end of March, it will be becoming available in German. And the link to that is in the chat. There is a link to the Your Clean Language Questions Answered ebook in the chat, which gives a whole bunch of other things that you might find useful and interesting. I also want to quickly share some links to my day job, which is creating and designing and devising really highly effective online events and hybrid events. If you're interested in that kind of thing, there are some links there for that as well. And before we go into the questions and all the rest of that, is it possible that we could see your answers to the question, when you're working at your best, you're like what? Are you willing to share those and hold those up to the camera? So, and once again, do have a look around and notice what everybody else is sharing. Interesting similarities and interesting differences. And some fantastic drawing. Thank you very much indeed. Please put those down. So in the next small breakout group, you're just going to spend a couple of minutes exchanging ideas about what you are going to do as a result of having been here today. When you come back, I'm going to ask you to share one idea in the chat of what you're going to do as a result of having been here today. I'm going to mix you up into pairs. Let's repeat that Chatterfall activity. What's one thing that you're going to do as a result of having been here? Please write your answer in the chat, but don't hit return just yet. Lots and lots and lots of interesting answers there. Fantastic, thank you. And when all of that, we've got just over 10 minutes for a bit of a Q&A. What else would you like to know about all of this? What curiosity has been inspired? Let's throw the floor open. What do you want to know?
So I'll go since I asked that question about having time for questions. So I'm thinking specifically about the work that I do across cultures between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And one of the interesting processes, I guess, that unfolds in cross-cultural meetings is because Indigenous people kind of are very fluid, walking back and forth between their own culture and mainstream culture, and subtler people and organizations don't have that comfort level and are always nervous about saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing. I think it'd be helpful if we could walk into those Indigenous metaphors in a way that feels safe for everyone. But it's so easy for my Indigenous colleagues to just default to mainstream because they know what my metaphors are, right? So they always tell me that I'm just getting, like, you're overthinking all of this and don't get so caught up in it. But the people from non-Indigenous culture and organizations are very curious and they would like to do a better job of honoring Indigenous culture, but they don't know how. I thought this seems like these conversations about metaphors would be a very open and honest and safe way to have some of those discussions. Anyway, wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I think it's a really, really interesting question. And I think clean and thinking from a clean perspective of things really helps one to understand just how much we are constantly laying our metaphors on other people. We're pushing our presuppositions, we're pushing our judgments on other people without any justification for doing that. But people have been brought up with things like the golden rule, the idea of do as to others as you would have them to do to you. But that implies that they are just the same as you. And actually they're not. Creating enough space for real, genuine difference is part of what clean is best at, but it's not perfect at it. And I think acknowledging that imperfection is part of the richness, to say, look, I'm trying to do this, but I know that I'm not going to do it perfectly. So when the clean language questions are stripped as far as possible of metaphor and presupposition and the questioner's stuff, we know that they're not perfect at it. So while I don't really have much experience of Indigenous peoples or any of that kind of thing, I can talk about how clean language questions have been used quite extensively to work with people who have neurodiverse conditions. So autism, dyspraxia, all these kind of things. There are actually two competing organizations in the UK which both use clean language as their core methodology to coach and help to integrate people with neurodiverse conditions into the workplace. And I think that's really quite interesting, because the idea is clean can help us to really understand someone whose life experience is very different from ours. Understand what it's actually like to see the world through their eyes, from their point of view. And I find that really interesting. And I think there could be a whole other 2-hour conversation about all of that. Thank you. Christy.
Thanks, Judy.
Thank you. So I threw my question in the chat earlier, but one of the things that came up in one of our groups was, if we're not bringing the metaphor as the facilitator and we want to grow, we want the metaphor to come out organically from the group, what about the fact that there will be different metaphors that will come out from different individual humans in that group? How do you find a consent? Are you trying to find a consensus of a metaphor? Well, Kathy very kindly pointed me to the page in the book where this is covered, but can you give us a preview?
I did wonder what page 183 was. Yes, so there are, if you've got a room full of people, all of whom have a different metaphor for a thing, the first question is, does that matter? Metaphors are brilliant for carrying information between people. So a lot of you are using metaphor very explicitly to tell stories, to share information. We know how iconography can really help to direct people around a space. All of those kind of things are shared metaphors, and we as facilitators introduce them. Now, it matters that those are shared metaphors and shared symbols, because if we all use different ones, we wouldn't know which was the ladies and which was the gents, or whatever else it might be. So shared metaphors are important in certain circumstances, and in other circumstances, it's absolutely fine for everybody to have a different metaphor for the same thing. So you might say, for me, my team is like a flock of birds, and for my boss, the very same team is like a Formula One pit team. What that does is it tells everybody how everybody else is thinking about the team. If, on the other hand, the boss says, we need to be called Team Formula One, and we're definitely going to be operating like a Formula One pit team, that gives me a choice. I either buy into his metaphor and stay, or not. If I really can't buy into racing around like a Formula One pit team, maybe I belong somewhere different. And Caitlin Walker has made a big thing of this, that when she goes into an organization to work with a team using their individual metaphors, she often warns the boss that some people may find that they want to leave as a result of this process, that it doesn't necessarily work out. On the other hand, sometimes you've got a group of people working on a thing and a single shared metaphor just naturally emerges, and you don't need to start picking apart what everybody meant by the metaphor. So one example is a team of software developers were working on a set of programs. I can't remember what they were doing, but they came up as a group with the idea that they wanted it to be like a washing machine. In that, a washing machine has a limited number of programs. It does only so many things. An old-fashioned washing machine only did one or two things. It washed or it span, maybe it rinsed, and that was it. Nowadays, you have to have an app to work out how many things you can do with your washing machine. And they were using this metaphor of the washing machine to help people become clear. How complicated do we want this to be? Do we want it to be like an old-fashioned twin tub, or do we want it to be the kind that you need an app to drive? Does that answer the question, Christine, or have I just gone off on one?
No, I think that's helpful. I think part of why it came up is that somebody mentioned that they will take a Grove template, for example, and take it into a group. And here it is a journey that looks a certain way visually. And so if you get to your group then and they see it differently, either as not a journey or a different kind of journey, well, now you're kind of stuck in the wrong metaphor. And or, you know, if you're not using a template, well, then maybe you have the opportunity to say, like, is there ever a hybrid situation where you say, we're going on a journey, what kind of journey is it? Where you can give them guide rails, but not impose your metaphor.
Yeah, I think that's a super thing to do. And yes, you can include clean language questions in that kind of process. The bit where you are suggesting a metaphor is not clean, but that's fine. You're combining things in the same way that you as a facilitator combine things all the time.
Thank you.
And there was a similar question from Richard in the chat. Does clean language have a suggestion for teaching people a new metaphor? By definition, no. Clean language is, its purpose is to help people explore and share their own individual metaphors. And any emergence of a shared metaphor is incidental. That doesn't mean that teaching people a new metaphor is wrong. And what often happens when groups and teams share their metaphors for working at their best, they find themselves cross-fertilizing with each other, particularly when new people join the team. Oh, when I do that process, it's like I'm climbing these steps, and there are 6 steps, and you do this, then this, then this, then this, and so on. And one person using a metaphor for how they do the job can really help a new starter to understand how the job should be done. So just people sharing their individual metaphors can infect other people. Does that answer the question, Richard? Okay. We have 2 more minutes, which means that one of the things we need to do right now is just take a moment for Barb to share these beautiful drawings that she's been doing during the session. Can you spotlight her? There we go.
There. No, I had a great time listening. If anyone was watching me as I was working, I would make things bigger, make things smaller, move them around. You know, it was very interesting listening to you talk, because you were very, very clear. And you know, I love working on the iPad because it's so easy to erase. And so sometimes I'll write things knowing that I might not keep it. But I noticed that many times you actually repeated almost the exact same words. And that was really helpful. So some things are on here that were said 3 or 4 times. And that was kind of fun. And I was debating with myself. There was a really interesting conversation early on about how does it feel to keep asking, is there anything else about X? And that knowing when to open or allow the field to close. And I was just sort of internally debating with myself about, is this my own personal interest with that question, or does it merit staying on the chart? And now that I've mentioned it, I will just leave it in there.
Thank you very much indeed. So interesting being with you all. We are out of time. Right at the beginning of the session, Brian shared my contact information. I'd love to connect with you on LinkedIn, on Twitter, by email, whatever. Chase me up, follow the links. There is a lively and active clean language community all over the world. Kathy, remind me, if I haven't got your details, drop me an email, because there are a number of people in the UK NHS who are using clean language in NHS context that I think you should be linked with. Anyone else that needs specific connections, just message me and ask, and I'll do my best. Throw the talking ball to Brian.
Thanks a lot, Judy. So let me just say that Judy, thanks to her, she raised over $250 for the Buddy Whitethorn Foundation. I included the link into chat if you'd like to learn a little bit more about that foundation. Also, I've been pulling out the resources that are in chat and adding them to the events page. So if you go to the comments, you'll be able to see all of the resources that are in there. Let's do a big Nova Scribes thank you for Judy Rees. Judy, thank you very much. This has been awesome.
Thanks, Judy.
Thank you.
Thank you
It's been
so much.
brilliant being here.
Thank you, Brian, for putting these together.
Fantastic.
See you again soon.
Thank you. Bye.